The old house at Hollowmere Lane had stood silent for years, until a chilling discovery changed everything. Welcome to Mystery Files. I am your host, Raven. Drop your location in the comments and join tonight's investigation. Your thoughts make these stories even more rewarding. Let's begin. It was upon one of those raw November evenings when London seems less a city of stone and men than a vast breathing creature exhaling smoke and damp, that the affair of Hollowmere Lane first intruded upon the ordered disorder of our rooms in Baker Street. The fog had settled early over the thoroughfares, pressing its yellow face against the windows and blurring the lamps until they appeared as dying, stars suspended in a sea of vapor. A cab passing below was heard before it was seen, and the footsteps of pedestrians came muffled and uncertain from the pavement, as though the whole world had been wrapped in felt. Sherlock Holmes had spent the greater part of the afternoon in that strange silence which, to those who did not know him, might have suggested idleness, but which I had long since learned to recognize as the most active state of his remarkable mind. He lay upon the settee in his purple dressing gown, his long, thin fingers pressed together beneath his chin, while his eyes, half closed, rested not upon the ceiling, but upon some inner landscape invisible to me. Upon the table beside him lay a heap of tobacco ash, 3 newspapers, a chemical retort, and a violin with one broken string. The scene, chaotic as it appeared, was to Holmes as orderly as a surgeon's tray before an operation. I had been attempting to interest myself in a medical journal, though the weather and the hour inclined me more toward the fire than toward science, when Holmes suddenly said, "You have been visited this afternoon by a man of military habits, who has lately taken to writing with his left hand." I lowered the journal and stared at him. "My dear Holmes, I have not spoken a word of it." "No, but your blotting paper has. There is the impression of the note you wrote in reply to him, and the hand in which you addressed it is unusually careful, which suggests that the correspondent was not intimate. The faint odor of boot polish upon the hearthrug tells me he stood there longer than politeness required, with his feet set apart in the parade fashion. As for his writing with the left hand, you have placed his card beneath the paperweight. The letters are firm but slant unnaturally backward, and there is a drag upon the lower strokes, such as one sees when a right-handed man is compelled by injury to employ the other hand." I picked up the card in astonishment. It bore the name Major Arthur Prendergast, late of the Indian Staff Corps. "You are quite right," said I. "He came regarding an old wound in the shoulder, and he wore a blue scarf, had traveled recently by train and distrusts his nephew. Holmes, my dear Watson, the scarf fiber is upon your sleeve. The Bradshaw lies open at the Brighton line, and no man speaks so long upon a hearthrug unless he is complaining of a relative or politics. As I see no parliamentary paper nearby, I select the nephew. There was that dry glimmer in his eyes which told me his spirits were rising. Yet before I could reply, there came a sharp pull at the bell below, followed almost immediately by a second, more urgent than the first. Holmes lifted his head. "A client in agitation," said he. "Not Lestrade. He rings once and trusts to the dignity of the law to carry him upward. This person either fears delay or dreads being followed." A minute later, Mrs. Hudson entered, her kindly face bearing that expression of alarm which visitors of unusual appearance often produced in her. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes. She would not give her name at first, but says it concerns a death in Hollowmere Lane." At the name, Holmes' eyes opened fully. "Hollowmere Lane," he murmured. "That narrow turning off the old Hampstead Road. A curious pocket of antiquity amid modern ugliness. Show the lady up, Mrs. Hudson." Our visitor entered with the uncertain step of one whose strength has been spent before the journey is completed. She was a woman of perhaps 28, tall, pale, and dressed in deep mourning, though not of recent purchase. Her veil was thrown back, revealing a face of intelligence and refinement, now drawn by anxiety into an expression almost painful to witness. In one gloved hand she held a small leather case, The other, I observed, was clenched so tightly that the knuckles showed white beneath the kid. Holmes rose and placed a chair for her with that grave courtesy which he could command when the occasion warranted it. "You are Miss Eleanor Vane," said he. The lady started violently. "You know me? I know that you wished not to be known until necessity conquered caution. Your initials are upon the corner of your handkerchief. The morning is not new, therefore your grief is not fresh. Yet your distress is. You have come not from the first shock of bereavement, but from some circumstance arising after it. Pray compose yourself. Watson, the brandy." She accepted the glass, but scarcely touched it. "My brother," she said, and her voice trembled despite an evident effort at control. "Julian Vane was found dead this morning in our family house at Hollowmere Lane. The police say it is suicide. Mr. Lestrade is there now. I have come because I know it is murder." Holmes did not move, but I saw his gaze sharpen. "On what grounds?" "Because my brother was afraid of death," she answered. "That may sound foolish, but it is true. He feared illness, darkness, even the creaking of the old house at night. He would no more have taken his own life than he would have walked willingly into fire." "Fear of death," said Holmes, "does not always prevent self-destruction. Sometimes it hastens it." She flinched, but continued. "There is more. 3 nights ago he sent me a note. I was staying with my aunt in Kensington. He wrote only, 'If anything happens at Hollowmere, remember the east window and the clock that does not strike.' I thought it some nervous fancy. He had been unwell and much disturbed. This morning, before breakfast, a constable came." Holmes extended his hand. "The note!" Miss Vane opened the leather case and drew from it a folded sheet. Holmes took it, laid it upon the table, and examined it first without touching, then lifted it delicately by one corner. The writing was small, hurried and uneven. "Written in haste," said he. "No address upon the sheet. Delivered by hand?" "Yes, by our old servant, Mrs. Barlow." "The east window and the clock that does not strike. Very good. And how was your brother found?" "In the library. The door was locked from within. The window was fastened. His pistol lay beside him. There was a wound at the temple. The servants heard no shot, but the house is old and the library lies in the rear wing. The police say he must have died sometime after midnight." "Who was in the house?" "My brother, Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, a young footman named Ellis, and Mr. Silas Crewe, our cousin." At this last name, her voice altered almost imperceptibly. Holmes observed it. "You distrust Mr. Crewe." "I do not accuse him," she said quickly. "But my brother quarreled with him last week, over some papers belonging to our late father. They concerned the estate. Hollowmere House was left to Julian, but there were complications. Old debts, old agreements, I do not understand them." "And Mr. Crewe remained in the house after the quarrel?" "Yes. He said he had business in London and no other convenient lodging." "A forgiving household," Holmes remarked dryly. "Was anything missing?" Miss Vane hesitated. "That is the strangest part. Nothing of value, according to the police. Yet my brother's writing desk had been opened." "Forced?" "No, opened with his key, and the key in his waistcoat pocket." Holmes leaned back, his lids drooping. To another man he might have seemed disappointed. To me he had become intensely interested. "Pray continue. There was one more matter. When they found him, the clock upon the mantel had stopped at 2:15. But that clock, Mr. Holmes, has not worked for years. It belonged to my mother, and Julian would never allow it to be repaired or removed." "The clock that does not strike," Holmes whispered. A silence fell in the room, broken only by the coal settling in the grate. Outside, a hansom rattled past through the fog, its wheels sounding strangely distant. Holmes rose abruptly and began to pace. His long figure moved back and forth before the fire, cutting in and out of the red light like a restless shadow. "Miss Vane, you have done wisely to come." A locked room, a nervous gentleman, a stopped clock, a warning note, and an open desk whose key remained upon the dead man. "Yes, Watson, this has the elements." "Then you will take the case?" she asked. I have already taken it. The relief that passed across her face was so sudden that she seemed for a moment near collapse. I moved instinctively forward, but she recovered herself. "There is one thing I beg of you," she said. "Do not allow them to bury the truth beneath the word suicide. My brother had many weaknesses, but he was not a coward in that way." Holmes looked at her keenly. "You loved him. He was all I had. Then we shall attempt to give him justice, if justice is the word required." He turned to me. "Watson, your coat. A revolver, if you please. Not that I anticipate violence, but anticipation is the difference between precaution and obituary." Within 5 minutes, we were descending the stairs into the choking fog. Miss Vane's cab waited at the curb, its horse stamping impatiently, its driver a vague, dark bulk above the lamps. As Holmes stepped in, he paused and looked upward at the dim yellow windows of our rooms. "The east window," said he softly. "Why should a dying man direct attention to a window that was fastened? And why mention a clock that does not strike, unless someone had made it speak?" I confess that the phrase sent an unpleasant chill through me. For though I had accompanied Sherlock Holmes through many sinister corridors of human wickedness, there was something in the notion of an old dead clock suddenly bearing witness in a silent house that touched the imagination with a peculiar dread. The cab lurched forward, and Baker Street vanished behind us, swallowed by the fog. Ahead lay Hollowmere Lane, and with it a house in which, if Miss Eleanor Vane spoke truly, murder had contrived to wear the mask of solitude. The cab rattled along the uneven stones of Hollowmere Lane, the fog curling about us like a living thing. Holmes sat stiffly beside me, his eyes narrowing at every shadow that stretched from the gas lamps, as if he were weighing the character of each silhouette before it even arrived. Miss Vane clutched the leather case tightly upon her lap, her knuckles pale beneath the delicate leather of her gloves. I could hear the subtle hiss of her breath through her veil, and I knew her anxiety had not lessened since the moment she stepped into our rooms in Baker Street. Upon reaching the house, the cab stopped abruptly in front of a structure that seemed more ancient than the lane itself. Hollowmere House was a somber affair of grey stone and weathered brick, its gables jutting into the fog as though to pierce the very sky. The library wing, where the tragedy had occurred, protruded slightly, and a series of tall, narrow windows reflected the faint flicker of the lamps from the street. Holmes observed everything silently, his long fingers resting upon his knees, the very picture of calm calculation, while I could scarcely hide the nervous anticipation that fluttered in my chest. The hall door creaked as we entered, and Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, appeared immediately, her face pale and anxious. "Mr. Holmes, thank you for coming. The police are in the library, but I feel there is something they are not seeing." Her hands trembled as she spoke, wringing her apron, yet her eyes were keen and alert. Holmes inclined his head without a word, his gaze already scanning the corridor for detail. I followed, noting the subtle impressions his eyes picked up. Footprints upon the mat, the faint trail of dust along the threshold, the irregular angle of a picture frame. Every ordinary thing seemed extraordinary in Holmes's perception. The library itself was dimly lit, the heavy curtains drawn back to reveal the fog pressing against the windows. The air was heavy with the scent of aged wood, old paper, and something more elusive, a faint metallic tang that suggested disturbance rather than decay. There, upon the carpet, lay the body of Julian Vane, or, rather, the place where he had fallen. Holmes's eyes immediately settled upon the arrangement. The pistol lay slightly askew beside the chair, its barrel catching a sliver of light, while the fallen key glinted faintly on the polished desk. Mrs. Barlow hovered near the doorway, her lips pressed together as though to suppress some confession she could not yet articulate. Holmes moved toward the desk, his long legs silent upon the rug. He examined the key first, lifting it delicately between 2 fingers and turning it over as if it held the secrets of the universe. A man does not leave a key beside him when he wishes to end his life, Watson. A suicidal intent is simple, direct. It requires no puzzle. And yet here we find the instrument beside him, not in his grasp. Curious. He leaned down to inspect the pistol. The weapon bears no fingerprints other than those of the deceased. It was fired only once. Yet the powder residue suggests an angle inconsistent with a self-inflicted wound. His gaze turned sharply toward the window. The east window. Closed, fastened from the inside, yet perhaps not entirely secure. He tapped at the latch lightly, producing a subtle creak. Every door and window obeys rules of mechanics. Even fear cannot alter that. The question is whether someone exploited it. I approached the body cautiously. The wound, precise and small, indicated a practiced hand, yet Holmes' observation revealed more than mere placement. "Notice the lack of stippling, Watson," he said, "the absence of smoke on the skin. The shot could not have been at close range in the conventional sense. This is already inconsistent with the report given to Miss Vane." I nodded, realizing that the policeman's hasty conclusion of suicide was indeed premature. Holmes rose and began to pace again, his long shadow stretching along the walls of the library. "Mrs. Barlow," he said, "you mentioned Mr. Vane quarreled with his cousin, Mr. Crewe. Did he show any signs of concern regarding his cousin's intentions?" The housekeeper wrung her hands, her eyes darting nervously toward the stairs. He did worry, sir. About certain papers, matters of inheritance. But he would never have imagined murder. Cousin or no cousin, Julian was. He was cautious. Her voice faltered. "Caution is often the very tool that hides danger, Watson," Holmes murmured. He moved toward the mantelpiece, eyeing the stopped clock. Its hands were frozen at 2:15, just as Miss Vane had said. A clock that does not strike. He directs attention to it. Why? Because it bears witness in silence. Perhaps because someone has dared to manipulate it. A clue, Watson, one overlooked by those too eager to accept appearances. He turned suddenly to me, his eyes alight. "Examine the footprints, if you please." The impression upon the carpet shows a small number of steps, precisely 3, perhaps 4, each deliberate, not hurried. The powder from the fireplace has settled in a pattern, suggesting that someone approached the desk, handled the pistol, and returned to the window with care. The trajectory of the shot, the key upon the desk, the unmoving clock, all hint at a performance designed to deceive the casual observer. Mrs. Barlow's eyes widened. "A performance, sir?" "Indeed," said Holmes. "A facade of suicide. But suicide is an artless affair. Murder requires calculation." He moved to the fallen chair and studied its legs, noting a subtle indentation in the rug. The chair was positioned, not abandoned. Our victim could not have arranged this himself without contrivance, which suggests the presence of another in these few minutes. Yet who and how? Miss Vane, pale and anxious, clutched the edge of her seat. Then it was not my brother. "Judging by the evidence, madam, we cannot yet speak of certainty. But the circumstances are inconsistent with self-infliction." Holmes paused, his gaze sweeping the room with clinical precision. "There is something else." He moved to the desk drawer, examining the papers within. These documents, letters, accounts, contracts were not rifled through recklessly. The culprit knew exactly what he sought. And yet, oddly, nothing is missing. Why? He tapped his long finger upon a ledger, because he wished to unsettle, to suggest theft where there was none. Mislead, misdirect, classic. Observe how chaos is orchestrated in this household, Watson. Observe how the simplest details tell the greatest lies. I felt a chill creep along my spine. Holmes' gaze, piercing and relentless, fell once more upon the pistol. A careful hand, Watson. Precision, forethought, awareness of the house and its residents. This is a crime planned in shadow, executed with attention to detail sufficient to confound the local constabulary. He rubbed his thin fingers together, thinking aloud. East window. Clock, key, chair, footprints. A pattern emerges. But the final stroke, the final signature is yet hidden. "Holmes, can you determine who did it?" I asked, unable to restrain my curiosity. He shook his head slightly. "Not yet, my dear Watson. To conclude prematurely is folly. Observe, analyze, anticipate. The culprit is clever, but cleverness leaves traces, and that, I assure you, is where we shall find him." He turned to Miss Vane, his manner suddenly softening. "Do you know, madam, who else was in Hollowmere House last evening?" "The cousin, Mr. Crewe, and our footman Ellis, and Mrs. Barlow. That is all, I believe." Her voice quavered, but she spoke the truth as she knew it. Holmes nodded. "Good. You have already furnished us with the skeleton of the mystery. Now we must dress it with flesh, and see where the veins of truth run. Watson, prepare your notebook. Every movement, every word, every expression may be significant. The game, as they say, is afoot." Outside, the fog pressed harder against the windows, curling around the pillars and swallowing the lamps. Within, the library remained still, yet charged with a tension that promised revelation. Holmes' eyes glittered in the lamplight, the mind within them already turning over possibilities, testing hypotheses, discarding the improbable, embracing the plausible. And as I watched, I realized that Hollowmere House, ancient and silent, was about to reveal its secrets, not to chance, nor to the slow machinery of the law, but to the keen intellect of Sherlock Holmes. It was a murder that seemed simple at first glance, yet every element, the locked room, the stopped clock, the careful placement of objects, spoke to an intricacy that only a mind trained in the art of deduction could unravel. As Holmes moved among the shadows, measuring, observing, calculating, I sensed that the night would be long, and the path to truth both circuitous and perilous. Yet already, the first threads of the web were visible, and I knew that the tapestry, when completed, would astound even the most seasoned mind. The investigation had begun. Hollowmere Lane, silent and fog-bound, waited, and within its walls the truth lingered, hidden but palpable, like a note held between two fingers, waiting for the proper touch to release its sound. Holmes spent the remainder of that evening in the library, moving with careful deliberation among the furniture, his keen eyes tracing the faintest irregularities in the arrangement of objects. I followed at a respectful distance, recording each observation as best I could, though I knew my notes were mere shadows of the deductions forming in his mind. Miss Vane had retired to a small sitting room adjoining the hall, where she sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded upon her lap, trying in vain to maintain composure. The servants had been instructed to remain in the kitchens and corridors, their movements now reduced to hushed footsteps and whispered conjectures. There was a tension in the house, subtle yet undeniable, as though the walls themselves were aware that scrutiny had entered, and the very air would no longer protect secrets. Holmes began with the desk. He examined the leather writing case, gently lifting each paper and letter, running a finger over the edges to detect impressions, folds, and erasures. "Note, Watson," he said softly, "how the letters are arranged, not in the order of receipt, nor of importance, but seemingly by the hour of the day he attended them. Every movement calculated, yet the arrangement is unusual. A man who feared for his life might not have left so meticulous a record. Or perhaps he wished to create the impression of order before it was disrupted." He tapped the edge of the leather case, producing a hollow sound. "Here is a cavity, a pocket concealed beneath the lining though empty. Someone was aware of it. Either they retrieved its contents, or they intended to appear as if they had." I bent closer, my curiosity piqued. "Holmes, are you suggesting the murderer knew of the desk's secret?" "Precisely, my dear Watson. A man who merely kills does not concern himself with hidden compartments. A man who seeks to deceive, to construct a narrative of suicide, is always mindful of such minutiae. Observe, too, the polish upon the wood, freshly applied. Yet the object itself is unblemished. The perpetrator cleaned after handling it, but failed to remove a single telltale trace." He held up a small shard of paper faintly soiled. "Here, an impression from a seal, Though no wax remains, this is the whisper of movement, the ghost of a presence. We turned our attention to the fireplace, where ashes lay undisturbed except for the faintest indentation, as if someone had knelt there. Holmes knelt and scrutinized the markings with an intensity that made me uneasy. "The pattern is deliberate," he murmured. "See how the ash has been displaced. No casual footfall could produce this." Someone crouched, arranged an object perhaps, then withdrew. The absence of soot upon the floorboards confirms they were careful. This was no hurried intruder. My gaze followed his toward the east window, the very window to which Julian Vane had cryptically alluded in his note. Holmes tested the latch and the frame, tilting it ever so slightly. "A mechanism, Watson. Not faulty, but precise. One could unlatch it from within, and yet it leaves little trace. The perpetrator could have entered or exited without disturbance, creating the illusion of security. Every detail, however minor, is a signpost." He paused at the mantelpiece, examining the stopped clock, the hands frozen at 2:15. "The police accept this at face value, assuming it indicates the hour of death. But the clock has been manipulated. It does not strike, yet the minute hand is not aligned with the hour. Someone stopped it deliberately, leaving a subtle discrepancy. The dying man's note drew attention to it not as a clue of time, but as a signal. A symbol, perhaps, or a warning to the observant. Holmes rose, moving to the door that led to the corridor. He turned the handle, listening to the echo in the empty hall. "We must consider the other residents of the house, Mrs. Barlow and Ellis are devoted and would be unlikely to commit such a deed, though human nature is unpredictable. The cousin, Crewe, is more troubling. Access to the house, knowledge of the family's affairs, proximity to the victim, all render him a figure of interest. Yet we must not fixate prematurely. The evidence, though suggestive, must be corroborated." We then examined the body's position once more. Holmes crouched, running a long, thin finger along the carpet. "See the indentation here," he said. The body was moved slightly, perhaps to stage the scene, perhaps to mislead the authorities. The arrangement of the chair, the key, the pistol. Every element forms a tableau designed to convey a narrative of suicide, and yet each detail resists the simplicity of that story. There is deliberate contradiction. I noted the footprints leading from the desk to the window. "Only 3 steps, I observed, and yet it seems the room has been traversed multiple times." Holmes' eyes glimmered. "Yes, the steps are calculated, sufficient to suggest presence without revealing passage. The perpetrator moves as a shadow, minimal contact, maximum impression, and consider the absence of fingerprints other than Julian's. The murderer wears gloves, obviously, and yet cannot erase all evidence. Every careful hand leaves a trace for one who observes keenly." He then turned to me sharply. "Watson, recall Miss Vane's note regarding the desk key. It was found beside the body, yet the drawer had been opened. The victim could not have locked the drawer after death. Therefore, the key was deliberately placed to convey innocence. That is a masterstroke of deception. Only a mind familiar with the habits of the deceased could anticipate such a belief." Mrs. Barlow had entered quietly at that moment, bringing a tray of tea. Holmes gestured toward it, motioning her to set it down. "We shall require sustenance for thought, Watson. A mind engaged in analysis is as the engine of a great ship. Fuel is necessary to maintain momentum." Once the tea was arranged, Holmes sat, steepling his long fingers. "Consider the scenario. A locked room, a single projectile, a note left by the deceased. A clock stopped at a significant hour, a desk left slightly open, a key placed with intention, footprints calculated to suggest solitary presence. All pointing to suicide, yet none of these elements withstand scrutiny. Each is an artifice. Observe, Watson. Deception relies not upon extraordinary ingenuity alone, but upon the misapprehension of the ordinary. Our murderer understands the psychology of the casual observer. The police, the servants, even the family, all are guided to misinterpret. That, my dear friend, is the brilliance of this crime. I found myself shivering at the precision he described. Holmes, can the perpetrator be the cousin? Crewe? Holmes shook his head slowly. Perhaps, but perhaps not. It is unwise to fixate. The evidence thus far allows multiple interpretations. What is required is a careful synthesis of all minutiae, the small observations overlooked by the untrained eye. Every detail, no matter how trivial, has its place in the grand puzzle. He rose again, moving toward the window. The fog pressed against the glass, muffling sound, blurring the world beyond. Holmes tapped lightly upon the pane. This window is more than an exit. It is a message, a witness, a tool. Observe how the perpetrator has played with perception. The east window is crucial, not as entrance or exit, but as a signpost. Whoever manipulated it intended to draw attention without revealing method. I noted the subtle tilt of the curtains, the shadow of the latch, the faint scratches upon the sill. Holmes, you are suggesting the window was staged. Precisely, Watson. Every element in this room has been carefully curated. Nothing is left to chance. Suicide is straightforward. Murder is art. The murderer is not merely violent, he is thoughtful, meticulous, almost obsessive. And that obsession is what leaves the clue. As night deepened over Hollowmere Lane, the house settled into an uneasy quiet. Holmes continued his silent scrutiny, his mind tracing invisible paths, reconstructing unseen movements, interpreting subtle signs. I watched him, knowing that the next hours would be spent not in speculation, but in the rigorous method of deduction. The patient extraction of truth from misdirection, the careful unweaving of a web spun to mislead all but the most discerning observer. And I understood, with the mixture of awe and apprehension that had never left me in his presence, that the solution was already forming in his mind, its pieces scattered across the library, waiting only for his hand to assemble them into a revelation that would astonish all who dared to follow. The investigation had deepened, the room itself seemed to breathe with secrets, and Holmes, ever watchful, prepared to expose them, one by one, to the steady light of reason. Holmes spent a moment surveying the library once more, his eyes sweeping over every object, with that acute attention to detail that seemed to pierce through the very substance of the room. The fog outside pressed against the windows like a living veil, softening the edges of the furniture, yet nothing within escaped his scrutiny. "Watson," he said abruptly, "we must turn our attention to the inhabitants themselves. The house yields its secrets in objects, but people reveal theirs in gestures, hesitation, and the minutiae of conduct." He straightened, long coat brushing the rug, and moved toward the doorway. "We shall begin with the cousin, Mr. Silas Crewe. There is subtlety in his movements that may betray motive." I followed him through the dim corridor to a sitting room where Crewe awaited, composed but alert. He was a man of middle age, tall, with a carefully maintained mustache and eyes that flickered constantly from one corner to another, as though measuring distance and weight simultaneously. Holmes observed him silently, his gaze moving over the man as if cataloguing every inch for later recall. "Mr. Crewe," he said finally, "you have been apprised of the circumstances of your cousin's death." "Yes, of course," Crewe replied. His voice was controlled, though a subtle tightening at the corner of his mouth betrayed unease. "A tragedy. I arrived shortly after the discovery. My presence is entirely coincidental." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "Entirely coincidental? And yet you were in the house the previous evening, were you not?" Crewe's hand hovered over the arm of his chair. "Yes, I was. Business regarding the estate required my attention. I left early. As you know, I did not anticipate, well, this." He paused, clearly calculating the effect of each word. "I assure you, I had no involvement in Julian's death." Holmes' eyes flickered with the smallest glimmer of amusement. "And yet you quarreled with him over papers concerning the estate." Crewe's jaw stiffened. "Disagreements over inheritance are inevitable in families, Mr. Holmes. But disagreement is not murder. No, indeed, Holmes said. But you understand how such quarrels might appear suspicious to one unversed in the subtleties of human conduct. Pray tell me, what documents did your cousin guard so jealously? Crewe leaned back, his expression tight with controlled irritation. Documents regarding the disposition of the estate, debts, legacies, financial obligations. Julian was meticulous and secretive. I cannot account for the exact contents. My involvement was limited to legal oversight. Holmes' gaze swept the room again, noting the precise placement of the furniture, the subtle tilt of a framed map, the faint crease upon the carpet near the door. I see. And yet you remained in the house long enough for someone to stage a tableau, to manipulate the east window, the stopped clock, the pistol, and the key. You have a keen appreciation for your surroundings, Mr. Crewe. You understand, of course, that these details form the first impression of a scene, and first impressions are lasting. Crewe swallowed, a brief flicker of unease crossing his face. I understand. Holmes moved closer to the window, tapping the latch lightly. The east window, Mr. Crewe. The note left to Miss Vane references it directly. Did your cousin ever speak to you of its peculiarities? Crewe's eyes narrowed. No. It is an old window. Faulty, perhaps, but I was unaware of any significance. Holmes nodded slowly, then turned to me. Watson, notice the tension in his hands. He gestures minimally, yet every movement is deliberate, controlled. The conscious mind attempts to suppress the unconscious, but the unconscious always betrays motive, intent, or fear. He turned back to Crewe. Were you aware of the secret compartment in the desk? Crewe's posture stiffened instantly. No, I cannot say that I was. Holmes' eyes glinted, curious. And yet someone who had full access would have known it. Someone who knew the habits of Julian Vane would recognize its utility. Perhaps, Mr. Crewe, you were aware and merely deny knowledge to guard your innocence. The cousin's face paled imperceptibly. I know. I cannot claim knowledge of that which I did not observe. Holmes gave a subtle smile, more for himself than for anyone else. Very well. We shall return to that point. Now, you mentioned the estate documents and the quarrel. Can you account for your movements from the late evening until the discovery of your cousin? Crewe hesitated, as though weighing each word. After attending to the papers, I retired to my chambers. I spoke with the footman, Ellis, regarding delivery of some letters. Then I read until the hour when the alarm was raised. Ellis, yes, we shall speak with him next, Holmes said. The footman's account will prove illuminating, especially given his proximity to the library and the timing of the supposed death. We left Crewe to the dim light of his sitting room, and Holmes and I ascended the staircase to the servants' quarters. Ellis, a young man of perhaps 19 or 20, sat nervously upon a stool, hands folded upon his knees. Holmes' gaze took in his unsteady posture, the slight tremor of his fingers, the tension in his shoulders. You were present last evening, were you not, Ellis? Holmes asked. Yes, sir, the boy stammered. I delivered messages for Mr. Crewe and attended to the fire. Nothing else, sir. Holmes tilted his head. Nothing else. You were in proximity to the library when your master, your cousin, was found deceased. Yes, sir, but I heard nothing unusual. I swear it. Holmes' eyes never left the boy's. We shall see, my young man. Tell me. Did you notice anything unusual regarding the positioning of objects in the library? Chairs, desks, the clock. Ellis shifted uncomfortably. The clock. I did not look closely. It has always been broken, sir. Holmes's gaze sharpened, indeed. Yet the hand on the minute aligns strangely with the hour, does it not? A detail easily overlooked but significant to the careful observer. And the desk key? Was it always upon the desk, or was its position altered? The boy swallowed hard. I cannot say. I did not notice. Holmes nodded slowly. Very well, Ellis. Your honesty is noted. Yet remember, the smallest observation often illuminates the greatest mysteries. We shall require your attention in the morning, when light may reveal more than darkness conceals. We descended once more to the library. and Holmes surveyed the room in its entirety, his long fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Watson, consider how each inhabitant, each element, forms a part of the grand narrative. Crewe presents himself with calculated restraint, the footman with timid honesty, the housekeeper with anxiety, yet none is fully transparent. The objects, the windows, the clock, the key, the arrangement of the desk, all are manipulated. The murderer is precise, deliberate, and informed. He or she relies upon the assumption that the ordinary observer will see only what appears. I observed the east window, the stopped clock, and the pistol, and a chill ran through me. Holmes, if it is as you suggest, then the simplest explanation, the suicide, was designed to mask the true complexity." "Exactly, Watson. The simplest explanation is often the most artful lie. And in this instance, the lie is so carefully constructed that it resists immediate detection. But every lie bears a trace, a quiver of truth that escapes the casual eye. We must watch, observe, and anticipate. Only then shall the killer reveal himself." Miss Vane re-entered quietly, her eyes wide with concern. Holmes turned toward her, his expression softening. "Do not fear, madam, we are attentive. Every step, every gesture, every object shall be weighed. Your brother's death will not remain misunderstood. There is, however, much work to be done before certainty can be declared. And now, Watson, we must consider the sequence of the last evening in detail, reconstructing each action, each movement, from the quiet of the library to the subtle manipulations of the window and the clock. Only then shall the web of deception unravel in its entirety. The fog outside thickened, enveloping Hollowmere Lane in a pale, indistinct shroud, and within, the library seemed suspended in a tense stillness, as though time itself awaited the unfolding of Sherlock Holmes's deductions. Every object, every shadow, every gesture became a piece of the intricate puzzle, and I realized that the night had only begun to reveal the subtle machinations that had transformed Hollowmere House into a stage for artful deceit. Holmes's mind was already at work, arranging the fragments, discarding the irrelevant, illuminating the invisible, and preparing to expose the truth, hidden behind the carefully constructed illusion of suicide. Holmes spent the remainder of the evening in silent observation, pacing the library with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic. The gas lamps cast elongated shadows across the walls, and each creak of the ancient floorboards under his long strides seemed to mark the rhythm of thought within that extraordinary mind. I seated myself in a chair near the fire, attempting to translate the observations I had made into coherent notes. Yet I knew that my efforts were crude in comparison to the intricate patterns he perceived at a glance. Miss Vane had retired once more to the sitting room, leaving the servants to their minimal duties, and even the faintest rustle of movement drew Holmes' eyes like a predator, tracking the slightest disturbance in the air. After some moments of reflection, Holmes approached the east window, his long fingers brushing lightly across the latch, testing its firmness. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "The mechanism has been manipulated subtly, so that it could be opened or closed without leaving a trace visible to the casual observer. A simple trick of alignment, nothing more, yet its implications are considerable. Whoever knew of this feature had intimate knowledge of the house." I leaned closer, noticing for the first time the almost imperceptible scratches along the edge of the sill. "It could have been used to enter the room?" I asked, my voice subdued with apprehension. Holmes shook his head. "No, not entry, not entirely. The window is too narrow, and the traces do not suggest repeated use. It is a signal rather than a passage, an element of deception designed to attract attention to itself, without performing the function of entry. The criminal is playing with perception, constructing a tableau that misleads the inexperienced eye. The question, Watson, is why the east window was singled out in the note. Our victim did not intend to die alone. He sought to convey warning. He moved to the mantelpiece, examining the stopped clock with a light tap of his long fingers. The hands were frozen deliberately, yet misaligned in a manner subtle enough to escape notice. It is a signal, but one easily misinterpreted. The murderer assumes the observer will accept the simplest narrative, suicide. A clever mind exploits human trust in appearances, knowing it will conceal the truth. Holmes' eyes glimmered with that familiar spark, and yet this signal is legible to a mind trained to read beneath the surface. Note, Watson, the discrepancy. The hour hand points slightly past 2, while the minute hand is not precisely aligned. Only an observant individual would detect it. Only one who knows the habits of the deceased could recognize the significance. He turned suddenly toward me, eyes narrowing. The key, Watson. The key lying beside the body is a masterstroke. One cannot imagine a man ending his own life with a key deliberately removed from the drawer. The key was placed to suggest innocence, yet its position contradicts any act of suicide. The murderer anticipates interpretation, understands expectation, and exploits it. Every small detail has been carefully orchestrated. I glanced at the pistol, noting again its polished surface, the faint residue upon the grip. Holmes, the weapon. Could it have been fired by someone else without leaving marks? Gloves, Watson. Care, precision, and knowledge of handling. The murderer understands that a careless act betrays intent. Observe how the arrangement of objects, chair, desk, key, pistol, constructs the illusion of solitary action. Every element is deliberate, every placement a message. Holmes paused, bending slightly to inspect the indentation in the carpet. 3 steps from the desk to the window, perhaps 4. Deliberate, minimal contact, maximized impression. One must consider not only the act but the choreography surrounding it. We moved next to the desk, Holmes' fingers gliding over the papers and letters. The contents were not disturbed haphazardly, he said. The victim's correspondence remains largely intact. The perpetrator sought not to steal, but to create unease, to suggest theft where there was none, an exercise in misdirection. Observe the subtle crease here, the ghost of a seal on this page, the faint impression where something once rested. Evidence of movement and intent invisible to those who accept superficial appearances. I found myself shivering, the complexity of the crime striking me with each new observation. Holmes's gaze returned to the window. Consider the timing, Watson. The clock points past 2, the body found shortly thereafter. The perpetrator creates a narrative of self-destruction, yet the details betray calculation. The window, the clock, the key, the positioning of the body, all are manipulated to create a false narrative. And here lies the secret. The crime is not in the act itself, but in the deception surrounding it. Holmes then moved to the foot of the stairs, glancing toward the corridor. We must revisit the servants' accounts, for proximity reveals insight. Ellis, the footman, and Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, are witnesses to minor movements, minor conversations, which, when properly interpreted, illuminate the intentions of the perpetrator. The subtle lies of human nature are as telling as the physical evidence. He paused, fingers steepled. Every hesitation, every altered expression is a clue, Watson. We must consider them alongside the tangible elements. For murder is not merely physical, it is psychological. I noticed a faint disturbance in the dust along the corridor floor, barely discernible beneath the lamplight. Holmes crouched, tracing it with a single finger. "Ah," he said softly, "see how subtlety becomes revelation. These marks, overlooked by the untrained eye, indicate movement, pause, attention to detail. The murderer entered or exited with purpose, yet left only whispers behind. We must reconstruct the sequence of actions minute by minute, noting every step, every gesture, every glance, to reveal the orchestration of this tragedy." He rose again, pacing the room with long, deliberate strides. "Watson, you begin to understand that a locked room scenario is not always what it seems. Here, the mechanics of the doors, the window, and the key have been manipulated to convey simplicity, when in truth the situation is far more intricate. The criminal relies upon trust in appearances. The ordinary mind accepts the improbable as natural. The meticulous mind discerns falsehood in the ordinary. Miss Vane re-entered quietly, her expression apprehensive yet resolute. Holmes greeted her with measured courtesy. "Madam, your presence is helpful. Observations made in daylight may yield further insight. The servant's recollections, your knowledge of the household, and your awareness of your brother's habits, all these will contribute to understanding the precise orchestration of this crime." He paused, turning toward me. "We are now entering the phase in which the human elements must be considered, alongside the physical. Only by combining these two threads can we approach truth." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly. I will do whatever I can," she said softly. Holmes' gaze swept the library once more, noting every object in its deliberate arrangement. "The night is far from complete, Watson. Every shadow, every object, every gesture is significant. We have identified inconsistencies, yet their relation must be synthesized. The east window, the stopped clock, the key, the desk, the footprints, all point to deliberate artifice, and the human behavior surrounding these artifacts will reveal the perpetrator. Our work is to follow these threads, tracing them through the fog of deception, until the pattern emerges in clarity." He paused at the window, looking out into the night, the fog thick and opaque. "Hollowmere Lane guards its secrets well, but the mind of Sherlock Holmes is patient, Watson. And so we proceed, piecing together fragments until the invisible becomes visible, the concealed becomes exposed, and the murderer, if we are fortunate, reveals himself by his own subtle mistakes." I realized, as I observed his patient, relentless scrutiny, that the night would stretch long into methodical examination. Each object, each gesture, each trace of movement was a thread, and Holmes was prepared to weave them into a tapestry that would expose truth where all else suggested illusion. Hollowmere House, with its shadows and secrets, had begun to speak, and in the quiet tension of the fog-bound library, I understood that the heart of the mystery was still very much alive, waiting to be uncovered by the masterful application of observation, deduction, and human understanding. Holmes spent the following morning immersed in methodical preparation. The first gray light of dawn had filtered through the tall library windows, casting a pale glow over the heavy furniture and scattered papers, illuminating the minutiae he had scrutinized by lamplight the night before. I observed him moving with his habitual precision, measuring distances, testing latches, and tracing the angles of shadows on the floor. He carried a small notebook, not for writing but for reference, pausing to compare impressions of footprints and dust patterns with his mental map of the scene. Miss Vane, having returned from her brief respite, watched silently from a corner, her expression taut with anxiety and hope, while the servants performed their tasks with subdued efficiency. Wary of his presence and the intensity of his gaze, Holmes began by examining the pistol once more. "Observe, Watson, the angle of the barrel in relation to the victim's chair. If one were to attempt self-infliction, the trajectory would differ slightly. Yet the placement is too precise, almost ceremonial." He tapped the weapon lightly with a gloved finger. "Notice also the grip, polished, careful handling, yet the residue is inconsistent with the act of a nervous man. This is a hand accustomed to precision, deliberate control. It was neither impulsive nor accidental. The death was planned, yet staged with the skill of one familiar with human psychology." I bent closer to study the footprints leading toward the window, noting how few there were. "Holmes, there are barely any markings between the desk and the east window. One would expect a movement back and forth if the room had been traversed multiple times." "Precisely, Watson," Holmes said softly, his eyes narrowing. "The perpetrator minimizes contact, maximizing impression. Observe the spacing of these impressions. They suggest long legs, deliberate steps, and yet not the gait of a servant accustomed to domestic movement. The feet fall as a conscious performance, a choreography to mislead. 3 or 4 steps suffice to convey the presence of the deceased alone, while the true actions are hidden in subtlety. He moved toward the desk and gently lifted a ledger. Now, consider the documents. Nothing of value has been removed, yet the drawer has been opened. The key left upon the desk is a signal, a deliberate misplacement to suggest innocence. The crime, Watson, is in the performance surrounding the act, in the narrative constructed to misdirect every observer. And the narrative, I assure you, is being read incorrectly by all present, including the police. Miss Vane stepped forward slightly. Mr. Holmes, you believe the murderer is among those in the house? Holmes' gaze lifted to her with a rare softness. Indeed, madam. A crime committed with such intimate knowledge of habits, of schedules, of minute domestic details, is unlikely to have been perpetrated by a stranger. The subtlety of the deception implies acquaintance. But acquaintance alone is insufficient to identify the actor. The clues lie in both object and behavior. He then approached the east window again, tapping lightly upon the latch. The window was manipulated, yes, but not for entry or exit. It is a signpost, an element of misdirection. Notice the scratches upon the sill. They are superficial, created deliberately, perhaps with a fingernail or a small implement. Someone wished the window to appear tampered with, while in reality the mechanism was never used as a passage. He tapped the wood again, producing a faint sound. The message, Watson, is that attention to detail will reveal inconsistencies unnoticed by the untrained eye. That is why Julian Vane left that enigmatic note. I considered the note, still folded delicately in Miss Vane's hands. It mentioned the east window, and the clock that does not strike. The significance lies in the instruction itself, not merely the objects. Holmes nodded slowly, pacing once more. Exactly. The clock is more than a timepiece. Its hands were stopped deliberately, but misaligned slightly. Such a small discrepancy may escape notice, yet it signals observation. The perpetrator assumes the casual eye accepts appearances, but a discerning mind notes the irregularity. This is a game of subtle signals and deliberate misdirection. Every element in the room, objects, positions, angles, shadows, is part of the tableau. He paused, steepling his long fingers beneath his chin, eyes fixed upon the floor. We must now consider human behavior. Crewe, the cousin, presents restraint, measured gestures, yet subtle indications betray his awareness of the house. Ellis, the footman, appears timid and honest, yet even he may unconsciously reveal movement or hesitation. And Mrs. Barlow, attentive and anxious, knows more than she admits, though she is careful to maintain the appearance of propriety. The interplay of these behaviors with the physical evidence is where the truth resides. Miss Vane asked, her voice soft, "Do you think my brother suspected someone?" Holmes' gaze lingered on her face. He may have. His note suggests awareness, but limited ability to prevent his own demise. Observe, madam, that he chose subtlety, warning you through cryptic reference rather than direct accusation. This indicates knowledge of danger, but caution. The criminal's familiarity with the household allowed such orchestration, yet misjudged the perceptiveness of those attuned to subtle cues. Holmes then crouched beside the footprint patterns again, examining the carpet fibers. 3 clear impressions, Watson. Minimal steps to indicate solitary presence. Subtle traces of movement along the path to the window, yet nothing to confirm departure. The narrative is constructed for the observer, not for the victim. The murder is a performance, the stage is the library, and the actors are guided by deliberate manipulation. He rose suddenly, moving to the mantelpiece. The stopped clock, the east window, the key, the desk. These are all signals, but only a mind trained to see will interpret them. Observe also the absence of fingerprints other than those of the deceased. Gloves were worn, careful handling ensured no marks. Only residual impressions remain, almost invisible, yet detectable through concentrated observation. I looked about the room, understanding slowly the depth of the orchestration. Holmes, the crime is designed to appear straightforward, yet every object is a signal to those who can read them. Suicide is the story told, but the reality is far more intricate. Holmes' eyes sparkled with that familiar intensity. Precisely, Watson. The simplest explanation is often the most artful lie. The murderer relies upon the observer's trust in appearances. But every lie, however carefully constructed, bears a trace, a subtle quiver that betrays truth. It is our task to detect that quiver. He glanced toward Miss Vane, who had drawn closer, her face pale. Do not despair, madam. Each element, object, and gesture is being carefully weighed. The human and the material intertwine. Only by observing both can the perpetrator's artifice be revealed. The night's investigation is far from complete, but already we see patterns emerging from the fog of deception. Holmes moved once more to the center of the library, pacing slowly. Watson, we shall reconstruct the sequence of the last evening in exacting detail. The movements of all within the house, the timing of events, the positions of objects, and the subtle signals must be integrated into a coherent timeline. Only then shall the web of misdirection unravel, and the murderer, if not careless, will reveal himself through the very precision that he believes conceals him. The fog pressed against the windows outside, dense and impenetrable, as though the night itself sought to obscure the truth. Yet within the library, the air seemed charged with anticipation. Holmes's eyes, alight with the intensity of thought, swept the room once more, absorbing every detail, every shadow, every object. Hollowmere House, ancient and silent, had begun to yield its secrets, and in the meticulous mind of Sherlock Holmes, the next revelation was already forming, ready to illuminate the hidden patterns that had masked murder with the guise of suicide. Holmes rose abruptly from the library floor, where he had been crouched over the carpet fibers for the better part of the morning, and stretched his long frame. Watson, he said, voice taut with purpose, it is time we examine the house itself in greater detail. The rooms, the corridors, the stairways. Every passage may conceal the evidence we require. A crime of this subtlety leaves traces not only in objects and behavior, but in the architecture that frames them. He moved toward the door, gesturing for me to follow, his eyes scanning every inch of the walls as though they might speak. We began with the corridor leading from the main hall to the library. Holmes' sharp gaze noted every scuff upon the floorboards, the faintest indentation in the rug, the variation in the polish along the banisters. See here, he said, pointing to a nearly imperceptible mark along the edge of the carpet. A subtle shift in weight, almost imperceptible to the casual observer, yet it suggests someone paused here deliberately, as if to observe or await a signal. Timing, Watson, is as vital as action in a crime of this kind. I bent closer, straining to make out the faint impression. So the perpetrator not only staged the room, but rehearsed movement through it? Holmes nodded, eyes gleaming, every step calculated. 3 steps from desk to window. Yet the presence of these markings indicates additional movement unnoticed by anyone else. A trace left unconsciously, betraying intent and method. We continued to the stairwell, and Holmes examined the balustrade. Notice how the dust along the handrail has been disrupted in 2 distinct patterns, he observed. One pattern aligns with the footman's usual path, the other is unfamiliar. It suggests another person traversed these stairs recently, one careful enough to leave minimal disturbance, yet still imperfect in execution. Even mastery is imperfect when the mind is alert. At the top of the staircase, Holmes paused by the servant quarters. Ellis, the footman, has spoken truthfully as he perceives it, yet perception is limited by experience and expectation. Subtle discrepancies unnoticed by him provide insight. We shall observe him again under controlled circumstances, and he will inadvertently reveal what he believes hidden. We moved to the window overlooking the rear garden, the one Julian Vane had referenced. Holmes examined the latch, tilting it slightly to study the mechanism. This window, he said, was not used as an entrance or exit, but it was manipulated to create a signal. Note the scratches on the sill. They are shallow, deliberate, and positioned to suggest disturbance without performing the function of entry. Someone sought to draw attention to this window, confident that others would infer access where none existed. He crouched to examine the floor beneath it. Here are scuff marks, faint yet telling. They align with the subtle impressions from the library carpet. Someone moved deliberately from the desk to the window, staged an action to create the illusion of independence, then returned. The sequence is precise, calculated to mislead. Observe, Watson, how minimal contact maximizes impression, a choreography of deception. Returning to the library, Holmes focused once more on the mantelpiece and the stopped clock. The misalignment of the hands is crucial, he said. The hour and minute are slightly discordant. A careful mind notes such subtleties. An inexperienced observer accepts them without question. This is deliberate, a signal to anyone who would notice, yet overlooked by all others. Our perpetrator assumes this subtlety will be missed, and indeed it was. Only acute observation, patience, and an understanding of human expectation will reveal the truth. He picked up the ledger from the desk and flipped through the pages. The contents were not disturbed for plunder. The drawer has been opened, yet nothing removed. The key placed upon the desk is a signal, intended to convey innocence, while the orchestrator of the act manipulates perception. Consider the psychological dimension. Misdirection is as vital as the act itself. The simplest narrative, suicide, is the camouflage, and every observer, from Mrs. Barlow to Lestrade, accepts this narrative because it aligns with expectation. Holmes moved to the east window once more, studying the latch and the light shadows upon the sill. The perpetrator relied upon confidence in the ordinary mind, he said. They assumed minimal scrutiny. Yet here, Watson, we see the cracks in that assumption. Scratches, misaligned dust, subtle weight imprints. Small but revealing. Precision in movement is difficult to maintain when the observer is attentive. Every step of the criminal's choreography betrays a signature, a weakness, a tell. I followed him toward the library door, noting the positions of the furniture, the subtle disarray of papers, the slight tilt of a chair. Holmes' eyes darted to the floor once more. The 3 steps from desk to window, repeated movements, and the pattern of weight upon the carpet all suggest deliberate orchestration. The room is staged, yet the staging cannot conceal imperfection entirely. The mind behind this act is meticulous, yet human, and therein lies opportunity for detection. He paused at the mantelpiece, tapping the stopped clock. The clock, the window, the key, the desk, the footprints, all signals designed to mislead and manipulate, and yet each leaves a trace. The criminal's attention to detail creates both the illusion of order and the subtle hints that reveal chaos beneath. We must reconstruct the timeline, piece by piece, minute by minute, until the orchestration becomes apparent. Only then can we expose the deliberate performance of this calculated act. Miss Vane appeared in the doorway, her hands folded tightly across her chest. "Mr. Holmes, have you any idea who could have done this?" Her voice was strained, the hope and fear intermingled within it. Holmes turned to her, expression solemn yet reassuring. "We are not without direction, madam. Every inconsistency, every subtle mark, every manipulated object contributes to an emerging pattern. The perpetrator is among those present, familiar with the household and its routines, confident in the deception they have constructed. But even confidence leaves a trace, and that trace we shall follow." He gestured toward the library. "Observe all carefully, consider each detail, and remain attentive. The truth lies hidden in plain sight, and it will be revealed by patience, scrutiny, and a mind prepared to discern where others are blind." As the fog thickened outside, shrouding Hollowmere Lane in a pale, silent embrace, Holmes continued his meticulous examination. Every object, every shadow, every gesture became a piece of a complex puzzle, and I understood that the unraveling of this mystery required not only intellect but patience, observation, and the rare insight that distinguished Sherlock Holmes from the rest of mankind. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, and in its quiet stillness, the threads of deceit and truth lay intertwined, awaiting the moment when careful analysis would disentangle them, revealing the author of this artful crime. The day had grown older, yet the library of Hollowmere House retained the somber stillness that had characterized our arrival. Holmes moved with deliberate purpose, his eyes scanning once more the minutest details that might otherwise escape notice. I observed him from across the room, aware that every gesture, every pause, every tap of a finger was part of a larger mental operation, an intricate calculus of deduction that he executed with mechanical precision. Miss Vane sat quietly by the fire, her hands folded, her gaze shifting from the body to the east window, as if the objects themselves might betray the secret of her brother's death. The servants had withdrawn, leaving the three of us to the quiet study of both the room and its inhabitants, and I felt the tension of expectation hanging thick in the air. Holmes began with the key once more, picking it up delicately between long fingers and holding it toward the light. This key, Watson, is more than a mere instrument of access. Its position beside the body suggests innocence, yet placement here is deliberate. Observe the angle at which it lies, the slightest deviation from a casual drop. Only someone acquainted with Julian Vane's habits would appreciate the implications. This is not chance, it is choreography. He turned to me, eyes glittering. Every object tells a story if one knows how to read it. I bent closer, examining the pistol, noting the precise orientation and the slight smudge near the trigger. Holmes, the residue suggests careful handling. Perhaps deliberate positioning after the shot? Precisely, he said, tapping the barrel lightly. The act of firing is merely the first measure, the orchestration of objects. The positioning of the body, the manipulation of the east window, and the stopped clock, all are measures of intent, designed to mislead. A clever criminal anticipates observation and arranges both scene and perception to create a narrative that conceals truth. His gaze moved to the east window, the one Julian had referenced in his note. Holmes traced the latch and the sill with long fingers, pausing to note subtle scratches and impressions in the wood. The window was not used as an exit, he murmured. It is a symbol, a signpost. The perpetrator expected the observer to infer passage where none occurred. Subtlety is the hallmark of skill. One who relies upon direct action leaves the marks of haste and panic. Here we see neither, only deliberate suggestion. Holmes then examined the footprints from the desk to the window, observing the spacing, depth, and orientation. 3 or 4 measured steps. Watson, no hesitation, no shuffle. Deliberate, precise. Designed to suggest solitary movement, yet small inconsistencies betray rehearsal. Observe how the 3rd step aligns slightly off the intended trajectory, an unconscious slip that signals human imperfection. Even the most meticulous mind cannot escape the flaws inherent in action. He moved to the desk and opened the drawer again, inspecting the papers with painstaking care. Nothing removed, yet the drawer was manipulated. A signal of misdirection. The key left atop the desk amplifies this suggestion of innocence. It is an artful deception, careful to create the illusion of spontaneity while concealing intention. He paused, holding a letter folded neatly, its edges bearing faint impressions. Notice the marks here. They indicate pressure from handling, yet uneven, inconsistent with the routine use by the deceased. Someone sought to appear casual, yet left a subtle fingerprint of artifice. Holmes paced to the mantelpiece and tapped the stopped clock. Observe the misalignment. The minute and hour hands are not consistent. The perpetrator relies on the assumption that the casual observer accepts the simplest narrative. Yet a trained eye, Watson, recognizes inconsistency. Subtle, nearly imperceptible but crucial. The clock is a silent witness, a marker of a deception, and Julian's reference in his note suggests that he recognized it as such, even if he could not prevent the act itself. He turned to Miss Vane, who had moved closer to the table, her eyes wide with anxiety. "Madam, your attentiveness is of value. Note carefully what we observe, for the human element is as revealing as any physical trace. Crewe, the cousin, exhibits measured restraint, yet even he leaves signs in posture, gesture, and hesitation. Ellis, the footman, and Mrs. Barlow, the housekeeper, provide additional context in their movements and reactions. Each contributes, consciously or not, to the narrative of events. Holmes then crouched to examine the carpet fibers along the path from desk to window once more. The impressions indicate a choreography, deliberate and practiced. The perpetrator moves with intention, yet leaves minor deviations, the unconscious revealing what is intended to remain concealed. 3 steps a stage to suggest solitude. The actual pattern is more complex, but requires careful interpretation to discern. Every trace, Watson, is a breadcrumb. I noted the subtle creases along the edges of the leather writing case. Holmes, could the perpetrator have been searching for something? Perhaps, he said. Yet the absence of removed items suggests the intent was psychological. To unsettle, to create misdirection, to manufacture doubt. Theft is not the objective. Perception is the weapon. The arrangement of objects constructs the illusion of suicide, while concealing the deliberate orchestration of murder. Holmes rose suddenly and looked toward the corridor. We must consider sequence now. The timeline is vital. Who moved where, at what moment, and in what manner? Only by reconstructing the actions minutely can the orchestration be understood. The murderer relied upon expectation, psychology, and subtle manipulation, and therein lies the path to exposure. Miss Vane asked softly, "Will you know the perpetrator soon?" Holmes' eyes swept the room, resting briefly on each object, then returning to her with measured intensity. "The threads are being traced, madam. The human and physical elements interlace, revealing patterns invisible to the casual observer. Time, observation, and deduction shall expose the artificer of this deceit. And when the final sequence is reconstructed, the one who believed themselves invisible shall be revealed by their own meticulousness." Outside, the fog pressed against the windows, thick and impenetrable, yet within, the library breathed with the silent intensity of thought. Holmes' mind worked ceaselessly, mapping steps, testing scenarios, and anticipating error. Hollowmere House, ancient and silent, held its secrets, yet under the scrutiny of Sherlock Holmes, even the most artful performance could not escape exposure. The stage had been set, the actors observed, and the invisible threads of deception were beginning to reveal themselves in patterns that only the patient, the observant, and the relentless could discern. In that charged quiet, I understood that the resolution was approaching, and that the careful study of the minutest inconsistencies would soon illuminate the orchestrated cruelty concealed behind the appearance of suicide. The library was quiet, though a tension hung in the air, charged and expectant, as though the house itself anticipated revelation. Holmes stood before the mantelpiece, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of one who has traced threads invisible to all others and prepared to weave them into clarity. I seated myself near the fire, pen in hand, realizing that the culmination of days of meticulous observation and deduction was about to unfold before our eyes. Miss Vane, pale but resolute, clutched the leather case containing her brother's note, while the servants, summoned for the occasion, waited anxiously outside, aware that the ordinary rules of household procedure had been suspended in deference to Holmes' extraordinary scrutiny. Holmes gestured toward the body, the desk, and the east window. "Observe, madam, the careful orchestration of what seemed a simple tragedy. A locked room, a stopped clock, a key placed beside the body, and the carefully aligned pistol, all arranged to suggest suicide. Yet each element, when examined attentively, contradicts that narrative. Julian Vane did not die by his own hand. He was murdered. Miss Vane gasped softly, her hand rising to her lips. But who could do such a thing, and why? Holmes turned to the cousin Crewe, who sat stiffly, attempting to maintain composure. Mr. Crewe, you had the opportunity, the knowledge, and the motive. The quarrel over the estate, the familiarity with your cousin's habits, the access to the library. All of these placed you in a position to commit the crime. Yet it was your overconfidence that betrayed you. Crewe's eyes flickered, a faint tremor in his jaw betraying the first sign of unease. I had nothing to do with his death. I left the house early. I swear it. Holmes' gaze shifted to the east window. You believed the manipulation of the window would mislead all observers, that the scratches you created would suggest entrance or exit where none occurred. You assumed the clock, misaligned ever so slightly, would escape notice. You staged the desk and key with care, believing that the narrative of suicide would conceal your orchestration. Yet you overlooked the smallest errors. The imperfect footprint pattern, the minute inconsistencies in the dust, the subtle misalignment of the pistol after placement. Your meticulousness became your signature. He turned to the room, eyes piercing each object in succession. The key left upon the desk, the open drawer, the precise steps from desk to window, the minor disturbance of dust. All of these pointed to someone aware of Julian's habits. Only someone intimate with both the house and the victim's routine could conceive such an elaborate deception. Your hand trembled ever so slightly as you arranged these elements. It is in the smallest involuntary movements that truth reveals itself. Miss Vane's hands shook as she clutched the note. But the note, he wrote it. He intended to warn me, Holmes nodded. Indeed, Julian Vane was aware of danger, though unaware of its source. He left subtle signals, the east window, the clock that does not strike, intended to communicate with you, trusting that a keen mind would interpret them. The criminal did not anticipate that observation, patience, and deductive reasoning would expose the artifice. He fixed his gaze once more on Crewe. You entered the library after ensuring the house was empty of immediate witnesses. You fired the pistol at a distance calculated to create the appearance of self-infliction, then manipulated the environment to suggest suicide. But in your precision, you left the smallest deviations, the scuff of a shoe along the corridor, the superficial scratch upon the windowsill, the subtle misalignment of objects, all traces that only a mind trained to see could interpret. And that mind, Mr. Crewe, belongs to Sherlock Holmes. Crewe's face blanched. He rose shakily, but Holmes's eyes held him firmly in place. Your confidence misjudged the powers of observation. You assumed the ordinary would accept appearances. Yet it is in the extraordinary, minute details, unconscious gestures, and deliberate misdirection, that the truth resides. The murder was artful, yes, but even art leaves the faintest mark. Those marks, interpreted correctly, are inescapable. A constable entered quietly, summoned by Holmes in advance, and stepped forward. Crewe sagged into his chair, realizing resistance was futile. You will accompany us, Holmes said calmly. The evidence is clear, the pattern undeniable. Your deception is exposed. Miss Vane's face softened, a mixture of relief and sorrow. Thank you, Mr. Holmes, she said. I feared my brother's death would remain misunderstood, that justice would be denied. Holmes inclined his head. Justice, madam, is the careful application of truth. Your brother's warnings, your attentiveness, and your courage have aided in revealing the deception. Remember, the smallest observations, the quietest hesitations, often illuminate the darkest mysteries. He turned to me, a faint smile curving his thin lips. Watson, observe how the web of misdirection is woven, the staged suicide, the signals left intentionally, the manipulation of expectation, and the reliance upon others' assumptions. Each clue, each object, each gesture contributed to a deliberate narrative of falsehood. And yet, When analyzed with attention, patience, and deduction, the narrative unravels, revealing the reality beneath. I glanced around the library. At the precise placement of the desk, the east window, the stopped clock, the footprints, and the faint disturbances in dust. Each object, each trace, now spoke with clarity, forming a coherent whole, a testament to both criminal cunning and analytical insight. The artifice that had masked murder was dismantled piece by piece, exposing the truth in a way only Holmes could achieve. He finally turned to Miss Vane, his gaze gentle. "Your brother would wish for the truth to be known. Though circumstances conspired to mask it, careful observation and reason have restored clarity. Let this knowledge grant you some measure of peace." Outside, the fog had begun to lift, revealing Hollowmere Lane in the muted light of morning. Within the house, the intricate puzzle had been solved, the carefully constructed illusion of suicide dismantled, and justice poised to take its rightful course. Holmes moved toward the door, coat brushing the floor, his expression one of quiet satisfaction rather than triumph. He glanced at me briefly. "And now, Watson, the ordinary must accept what they cannot see, and we move on to the next puzzle that awaits. But in this house, at least, truth has prevailed." Miss Vane exhaled, a mixture of relief and sorrow washing over her features. Crewe, subdued and silent, was led away by the constable, and in the library, where subtle traces and deliberate manipulations had once concealed malevolent intent, the quiet now bore witness to the power of observation, reasoning, and the inescapable light of Sherlock Holmes's mind. The case of Hollowmere Lane, intricate and cunning, had reached its conclusion, satisfying both justice and the intellect that sought it.